The end is near. We are MythVision. Welcome to MythVision, Dr. Shelly Matthews. How are you?
I'm great. Happy to be here. It's a lovely Friday afternoon here in Texas. Happy to talk to you.
I'm glad you're joining me. I've been excited for this one for a few weeks now. Been chewing on that commentary, and you have a couple books there. Let me introduce you to our audience since you've never been on MythVision before, and then give everybody the plugs so that we can dive into whether or not the Apostle Paul and this author we call Luke were companions, and if Luke actually is writing about the literal historical events that are happening in Paul's day, et cetera, et cetera. So first things first is Dr. Matthews holds a doctorate of theology from the Harvard Divinity School, the Master's of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, and a bachelor's from the University of North Dakota. Her recent publications include a co-authored 2-volume feminist commentary on the Gospel of Luke, Liturgical Press 2021, a subject which she eagerly engages in public lectures and workshops. She is currently working on a book-length feminist guide to early Christian resurrection. She is the series editor for the SBL Press series, Early Christianity and Its Literature, and was the co-founder and inaugural co-chair with, and forgive me if I butcher this, Tat Seong?
Benny Lou. He goes by Benny, you can just say Benny Lou.
Benny Lou. Okay. Of the Society of Biblical Literature Program Unit on Racism, Pedagogy. I'm horrible with pronunciations. And Biblical Studies. Before arriving at Bright in 2011, she was the Dorothy and B.H. Peace Jr. Associate Professor of Religion at Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, where she taught for 13 years. She is an ordained United Methodist minister, Dakota's Area Conference. That was in brackets, so I went ahead and mentioned it. If I may, for everybody who wants to check out you back and go into your background and go to the website, you can pause this video at any moment, get your camera phone out, scan this code right here, and it'll take you directly to the website. Also, if you go down in the description of this video, the links are there where you can follow up after you hear what Dr. Matthews has to say today. I'm going to refer to her as Shelly as much as I possibly can, but I can't help, you know how I am, Professor, and I'm going to try to be as non-professional and be just, lay back and chill. But Shelly, thank you so much for taking your time.
I'm happy to be here. I was happy to learn about your podcast. See some of my scholarly colleagues who have talked with you, and I have a couple of friends who are very enthusiastic about, real fans of you, Derek. So I'm pleased to be on the show.
Thank you. Everybody, Amazon. You can't go wrong with reading the works that she's producing. I'm already starting on the Luke 1 through 9. I read her article. We're going to be discussing on Acts. This is going to be a excellent episode. I can bank on that right now. Just stick around. You won't want to miss it. But check out some of her works. You can also go to the Bright website, which is in the description. I believe it'll reference you to the books. Either way, get the commentaries, get your head wrapped around this material, because everything that you're saying in it is blowing my mind. And something to add as a caveat, here's the website for anybody who's interested. Once you scan that barcode, it'll take you here. Your sensitivity to seeing things in the text is bar none. It literally made me think, oh my gosh, how come it's stuff we take for granted that you'll highlight, and it makes us try to get into that ancient world and understand what's going on in Rome. or in the Greco-Roman world, what's happening on the ground, why they're saying things the way they're saying it. And it's just stuff that I just don't have the sensitivity. I would never have been clever enough to notice these things. So read her works for sure.
Wow. Thanks.
I mean, it is. It's worth it. Oh, did I mention we have a Patreon? Help support us here. I had John Collins on. I've just been doing a lot of stuff. There's something about your work about multiple voices, listening to multiple voices that makes it very important. And I recently did a couple shows and courses with Bart Ehrman, right? And Bart Ehrman was just saying to me, the greatest discovery that we have found isn't the Nag Hammadi. It isn't the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And I'm like, well, then what is it? How could those not be like the greatest things? And he said it's finding out that there are so many voices with differences of opinion. They don't believe the same. They disagree. They're, even in the same book sometimes, there's different people who are trying to speak up. And he said, if we start as scholars looking at things this way, and the lay people stop trying to harmonize and make everything this unified narrative, then we will actually start realizing more what's going on.
Yeah, no, I like that image of multiple voices, even within a text where it often seems that Paul is the only voice, but Paul is talking to people, right? And so and there's a famous argument by the biblical scholar Ann Wire that because Paul's trying to persuade people, if you pay attention to his arguments and then imagine, well, or how would this persuade, or who this would persuade, you can then reconstruct or imagine what other people in Corinth were thinking, right? So that's one example of multiple voices. Yeah, in the book of Acts, it's more tricky because the book of Acts is, I think, responsible for or is not solely responsible, but is trying to push the story into one version, one voice, in ways that some of our other texts are not. But let me...
Introduce us to the book of Acts. And of course, I read your articles. So just so you know, I have some questions. I only put 4 questions down. But okay. Maybe you introduce us to Acts and what you think's going on. Maybe tell us why you think it's so late. Well, it's not just you; it's many scholars.
Well, we're coming to the idea that Acts is probably a 2nd century text, most likely a 2nd century text than a 1st century text. A couple of things that I will say also in terms of, I think you mentioned something about Acts or the position that Acts is literally historically true. And I am among scholars who would really push back on the notion that the author of Luke and Acts is concerned about a literal historical record. One of the reasons for that is that the ancients didn't think that way about literal truth. So to begin with what's going on in Acts, I would start with the preface to the Gospel of Luke. Those of your listeners who have some biblical knowledge might know that the Gospel of Luke is unique in that it begins with the preface. It makes it more formal than the other Gospels. And in that Gospel, he addresses Luke, the character, I'll put that in quotes, we don't know who Luke is, but he addresses this work to Theophilus and says, he's studied, he's done the research, and he's going to put it all in order. He's going to provide an orderly account so that you might, it's often translated into English, so that you might know the truth. And I think that is a way that leads or confirms a sort of literalist view that's what, that if it's true, then it's history, then it's literal. But the phrase there that the author of Luke is using, this asphalia, is a word that it's better translated reassurance or security. And I mean, literally, so that you might know reassurance, or recognize reassurance. I would probably translate it so you might have reassurance about what's going on in among followers of the way, and to cast it as reassurance definitely tells you that the author of Luke and Acts has, if I will say, an ideology, right? He needs to reassure his elite patron that there's nothing about this movement, the followers of the way, that is subversive or disturbing, or that might tune out an elite person such as Theophilus is, whether or not Theophilus is real or just a fictitious addressee. He's definitely an elite patron, and that's who Luke's aiming at. I mean, a few other ways that I would point out that Luke is not a literal history, at least not in the modern sense of what a history is that the first church historian, the most prominent church historian of Christianity is Eusebius, a 4th century writer, and he borrows from the book of Acts. He incorporates pieces of the book of Acts, but Eusebius is very clear that he is the first historian. He doesn't call the book of Acts history, right? He doesn't treat it that way. So that's another way to think about it. And another way is, to think about it is that the ancients just didn't have access to the journalistic tools that we have. Famously so, and I don't know exactly who you've had on the podcast, Derek, and so maybe this is repeating something that your fan base already knows. But for instance, Acts is full of speeches, right? Paul stands up and speaks, Peter speaks, Stephen speaks. They speak, very long and eloquently, but is well known among historians. The ancients didn't have tape recorders. They didn't have stenographers. There are no records there are no literal records of ancient speeches. And so, as the famous historian Thucydides says, I wrote what I thought the person should have said, right?
Right.
So anyway, so the idea of what history, how one made a history back then is so different from now, and that they just don't have the tools. And also historians were trying to instill values in their readers. They thought of their readers as elite or striving to be elite. And so historians were concerned to tell stories that edified or that valorized their heroes and that denigrated their opponents. And
right.
Things, they didn't have to be truths. That is, they didn't have to be stories that actually happened in order to be used in the service of their history. So those are a few things.
Yeah, I wrote in my it's my third question, but I said this author Luke Acts is painting a picture for his reader, most excellent Theophilus, that Paul and the Christian church are innocent, but turn the guilt onto another group, the Jews.
Right.
And you use the term anti-Judaism, which I've had some scholars come on and just go all the way and say it sounds like anti-Semitism, but that might be anachronistic. It's close, and you could see why the conclusion's drawn, but it's more specifically anti-Judaism, and I think we're going to get into that, of course, in Acts.
Yeah, no, I can talk a little bit about that. Acts is anti-Jewish. I am contributing an article, and I think I sent you a draft of an article that I'm contributing to a volume on the New Testament and anti-Judaism. And what I would call it in the book of Acts is something very close to Christian supersessionism, maybe proto-supersessionism, but I would distinguish it from anti-Semitism in the following ways. Anti-Semitism, as traditionally understood, is about a racial essence, a belief, a prejudicial belief that there is this racial essence in another group that is wicked or demonic or whatever. But in the book of Acts, that's not it. The problem with Jews has nothing to do with their racial makeup, because the heroes of the movement are also Jewish, right?
And it praises them because they're Christ followers.
Right, so. Exactly. So the best Jews, or the best Christians, if you will, to use that language in the book of Acts, are Jews, right? Paul is a Jew. The apostles are Jews. Jesus is a Jew. And there are pious Jews as well, right? The anti-Judaism comes in the very strong message that the Jews in Acts who do not believe in Jesus are wicked, I would say. But it's not a racial essence. It's because of a political choice they make or a religious choice they make to reject Jesus as the Messiah. So that's the ground on which the division is taken. So it's not so much that Acts comes down on religiosity of Jews. In fact, the apostles in Acts, are very pious Jews. They worship in the temple, they pray, they read the scriptures, right? Like good Jews. They're circumcised, like good Jews. But the problem is that on this, what we call the plane of sociology, it's not their theology, but their what they believe, but their sociology, their deeds. And if in Acts, with few exceptions, if these Jews have rejected that Jesus is the Messiah, then they get depicted as demonic, really as demonic. It's not, famously, for some of your hearers, you might know that in the Gospel of John, there is this dialogue between the Johannine Jesus and the Jews, where he says, "Your father is the devil." And Acts doesn't exactly say that, but it shows them being demonic. That's what I would say. Instead,
you mentioned in that article the Roman imperial sociology, and if we read Tacitus, you point out, and you didn't go into that passage in the article, but it's already expecting the reader to already know that Tacitus is kind of making a jab at Jews and their sociology based on their beliefs, like what they do and their practices. And I'm sure it's a jab at Sabbath. I'm sure it's a jab at their not honoring the gods of Rome and things like that. I don't know if we're jumping in headfirst in the deep end already.
But Tacitus also says about Jews is that they're subversive. That they, all of the subversive elements, not just Jews, travel to Jerusalem, and that's where they do their so that they're politically subversive is what I would say something that Acts plays off on. That is, and politically subversive in the sense that, with the stoning of Stephen, this is an example I've meditated on a lot. They stone Stephen. That's just it's this chaotic crowd, and they drag him out and they stone him. And Romans did not like that kind of disordered execution, right? I mean, they executed plenty of people, but right, but it was through a juridical process, right, with a court, and they followed the right steps, whereas the Jewish, their problem or their crime, if you will, is that they are disorderly and they don't follow the rules when they're oppressing the Christians. But anyway, I interrupted you.
No. I'm like, I want to follow you wherever we go, but I do want to I just throw this out there. Is it highly likely, based on your estimation of Luke Acts, this author who's trying to address an elite, O Theophilus, which John Dominic Crossan thinks is a God-fearer, a Gentile who's interested in the Christ movement. But whether that is or isn't, we don't really know. The author seems like they may be a Gentile who are obviously Christ followers. And do you think that account in Acts is fiction? It is invented, of course, the narrative of Stephen as well, like who's documenting everything Stephen's saying here. But it's fiction to paint a picture about how innocent the Christ movement is. And can you tell us what's going on the ground in reality in the late first, early second century that would allow someone to want to invent this story to get an elite to come follow Christ?
Right. No, they're all great questions. I would qualify a bit. There is a new trend to argue that Luke himself is Jewish, writing within Judaism.
Okay.
And I have been persuaded, I find some of that interesting. But I would only say that if he's Jewish, he's a Jewish Christian who doesn't, who demonizes Jews who are not in his group. But he might be a Gentile. I mean, also that's a long held understanding that he might be a Gentile or a God-fearer. So what are the things on the ground? Yes, I would say, for instance, reading, if I could begin the way I like to teach the book of Acts on what's going on in the ground. And it also dovetails with one of the reasons that I think the book of Acts is late among writings in the New Testament is that the book of Acts anticipates what pagans, if I can say that in quotes, what, elite, polytheistic, non-Christian Greeks and Romans, what they will say about Christians when they want to criticize it. That is, there is this 3rd century Christian apologist who writes a dialogue. It's called the Octavia. And in it, he stages this pagan critic of Christianity who says, a problem with Christians is they meet in secret. They worship a crucified man, which means they're glorifying subversion. Their followers are the dregs of society, women and poor people, and they spit on our gods, right? They don't take part in civic society. And so I would say that Luke answers all of those questions by presenting Christians as well, in some ways, he really flips the accusation. For example, the accusation that Christians are the dregs of society. He instead shows all of these elite converts, some strikingly elite, and really some fantastically elite people. He claims, the book of Acts claims that Sergius Paulus, a Roman procurator on the island of Cyprus, I think your average reader that the eyes glaze over, okay, it's some Roman official, converts to Christianity. But a Roman procurator is someone who was in the Roman Senate and then is appointed for this, this 1 or 2 year, I forget the precise amount of time, to govern Cyprus. And the idea that a Roman senator or, a post-Roman senator in the 60s converted to, Jesus belief is fantastical. But Acts tells lots of stories of these elite people, often soldiers or Roman officials, who become Christ believers. And that's a response to the criticism that they're the dregs of society. To the question that women, it's just these silly women, he argues that there are women, but of course they're very respectable women. They're the elite women donors, and Romans could deal with elite women in public as long as they were, respectable women with money who supported the cause, the city or the causes they wanted supported. One of the interesting places where I think Acts has a very, is juggling or walking a very fine line is that the critique of Christians from an outsider's view, when Christians get to become more known, is that they are separatists, that they are antisocial, that they're atheists because they don't worship they don't worship the city gods, right? And, he says they spit on our gods in our temples, and they, disavow the public robes of office, which means they're antisocial. They don't participate in city governance. And that's a hard one for Acts because he doesn't want to say that the Christians observe pagan rites or worship those gods, right? And he doesn't, because if you are participating in the city, then you have to sacrifice to these gods, because every civic event involves sacrifice to the or the pantheon, the Roman pantheon or the Greek pantheon. So he tells the story in Acts 19 where there is a riot of people who don't like Christians. These silversmiths don't like Christians, and the city of Ephesus is going to persecute or hold on trial some of the Christians there. And the town clerk interrupts to say, wait, these Christians do not, these men here, actually I put down the quote, these men here are neither temple robbers nor blasphemers of our goddess. That is, Acts, he can't say that the Christians worship the other gods, but the best he can do is say they do not.
Well, he has so I love this. He is saying, he's putting in the mouth of a high official that they're saying, these guys are good guys. What are you doing?
Yes, these guys are good guys. They don't break the law, and they don't blaspheme Artemis, the goddess, which again, it's astonishing to define Christians as those who revere Artemis. I mean, and that's what he does. That's part of the context. Is Luke is trying to paint these Christians as upstanding citizens as best he can, and so they can't worship Artemis, but their friends in high places do, and their friends in high places think they're fine. Very clever. I mean, whatever else we say about Luke, it's very clever.
What would you do? If you wanted like serious, you wanted to convince someone who's higher up in society and they think that your stuff is just low blow, is this really worth getting involved? If I were to want you convinced, I'd get all the higher officials. I'd get elites. I'd get, if I wanted to get let's say I wanted to get a celebrity, I'm going to get other celebrities. I'm going to get Hollywood to speak. And then they're going to go, oh, Hollywood thinks. So it's a great tool he's using in trying to convince the reader.
Yeah, no, good. And he doesn't have celebrities, but he does have, he gets Roman officials. And that's over and over in Acts. The Jews, that is the non-believing Jews, accuse the Christians of being bad. A couple times it's Romans who accuse the Christians of being bad. But at every point, in comes the Roman governor. In comes the Roman proconsul to say, no, these Christians have done nothing wrong. Right. So over and over, there's this reassurance, which is what Luke promised his reader, reassurance. You might have reassurance about the unfolding of the way. And it's an orderly account because, again, order is very important. And now the flip side of that, and the tragedy of Acts, getting back to the anti-Judaism, is that in order to heroize or idealize the followers of the way, Luke does something that's common among, vulnerable groups under empire, and that is he points to the non-believing Jews and says, we're good, but look at them and how terrible they are, right? They're subversive, they're wicked, they break the laws, they conspire in evil ways. If Acts is written as late as we think it is, that is in the 110s, possibly the 120s. I would go to 130 some days. At that time, Romans, as Tacitus notes, Romans are experiencing violence or resistance of Jews in the provinces in the 110s, then that culminates in the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. So against that backdrop, Romans are suspicious of Jews because of violence and rebellion among some Jews. Luke is then making this, again, I think it's a very fine wire act. Yes, we adhere to or accept the good things about Judaism, like their ancient laws and their ancient established temple and, their rituals that are common among people of the Mediterranean, but the bad stuff, that the stereotypes of Jews as rebellious or wicked, that's the people who reject our movement. So
your article, just to give people a little tease, is that because this is scripture to Christians, they have been reading this with that tone in mind. This is so taking Luke in its cultural, historical context. We're seeing a tool being used to try and make Christians look good in light of all the accusations that are really going on around that might be making O Theophilus not so interested in Christianity. So here's a clever device being used, writing an account which may take some things historical, but also stretch those boundaries. Could Theophilus actually have found out that this, local so-and-so or magistrate or somebody who's in this power really didn't convert? Is there a way for him to even test this stuff, especially after the war in 70? Like what, I don't know. I mean, I'm just throwing it out there. Like, is he getting away with concocting some of this material for his reader, O Theophilus? And I don't know. It's a question, but
yeah, is he getting away with it? That's an interesting way to frame it. I do think the readers were not double checking. They're not fact checking because it's not a news, right? Luke is not a journalist, so he's getting away with it in the sense that Theophilus hears these stories. And again, even if Theophilus is historical, or whether or not he is, Luke's readers, even if they're not as elite, they like the story. They like stories of the elite, liking them, right? So I wanted to clarify that, and now I just forgot your train. Oh, did he get away with it? Well, I would say that most readers of this, I don't think were fact checkers. That is, they're like, they're not saying, is Luke really true? I'm going to do some data or find, send a reporter out to Cyprus to see if that person converted. But they're not fact checkers, but just reading the story gives pleasure, enjoyment, confirmation, worldview confirmation. So I think awesome. Did he get away with it? I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, the long story, Luke got away with a lot of things because it is our only continuous narrative of what happened, the early church after Jesus' crucifixion, right? Until the Paul in Rome, if Paul died in Rome. But it is, because it's the only account, I think it really is hardwired. That's one thing I mentioned in that article. It's hard to measure the way that the story of Acts is in Western consciousness as the story of how Christianity began. So in the sense, one answer to your question, did Luke get away with it? Yes, he got away with it in the sense that his version is so influential. And if I can just to think about one of the ways even a biblical literalist would have to concede that Luke is inadequate is that Luke's story is partial. He only tells one story of the Jesus movement beginning in Jerusalem. They go up into Turkey or Asia Minor, and then into Greece and off to Rome. So he tells that story of early Christianity, and that's the story we have in our Bible, New Testament, canonized. But we know from other sources we don't know them as well, especially if we're Western, we don't know them as well. But early Christianity flourished in Syria, right outside of the Roman Empire. Early Christianity flourished in Ethiopia, right? Just to pick two very prominent centers of early Jesus movement activity, where we have a considerable amount of textual evidence. But Luke doesn't tell that story. So he gets away with a lot of things. And one of them is pointing the story to the West, pointing it to Rome instead of the more global reach of early Christianity, which most of us in the West don't know about.
Yeah, your article was amazing. I can't wait for that to get published so people can go read it. Because you talk about some tough stuff that happened in the 4th century, where Christians are force converting Jews and burning synagogues and stuff in light of, and we can't absolutely Acts played that role, but it seems to be, like you said, hardwired into the thinking, the way and portrayal of Jews who are not Christ followers are bad. Because every turn in Acts, you point this out in your article, at every turn, the Jews are conspiring. It's like there's an omniscient author who's like, and then they went and they said, how do we kill this guy? We need to kill Paul. We need to concoct. And they actually kill Stephen. So now in the mind of Christians, they're looking at this, and we need to try and de-wire this out of their thinking, is that a Jew who doesn't follow Christ is either ignorant, is possessed by Satan, is a child of the devil, is, and all these horrific images. And then you have the extreme Articles of Zion, absurd anti-Semitic movements that are out there, that the guy you point out in the article who went to Texas held hostage Jews in a synagogue and thought, call the New York synagogue and get a hold of the rabbi, and the Rebbe will be able to call and say, hey, let that guy out of jail, as if they rule the world. There's a real bad conspiracy that comes out of this kind of stuff. And sorry, I'm getting a little bit hype here, but it's
No, that's great. I didn't know you were going to go there. But yeah, there is this problem. And again, as I am careful to say, I can't draw a line from the book of Acts to the protocols of the elders of Zion. They're in very different genres of literature. But on the other hand, the conspiracy feature really is part of the Acts narrative. And so if you read it uncritically, as many Christians do, then you're stuck with this picture of the non-believing Jews as really these wicked people. I will that can be a tough message for certain kinds of Christians to hear that, this sort of very, depressing and potentially violent inducing narrative is part of the early Christians. I would say that Luke, when he wrote it, right, he's not writing at the time of Constantine, so he doesn't have the power at that point. He's just one desperate group trying to carve out a place for his group. So he's saying bad things, but I don't think if he had known, it's the same with Jesus.
No, I get it.
If any of these people had known how it was going to unfold, but
that's like Paul. If we read Paula Fredrickson on Paul, she says Paul is within Judaism. He's at the cusp of the end of history. He is not trying to create a new religion. He is trying to gather in the nations, the ethne, at the end of time. And he has no clue. He's not thinking supersessionism and that the end and the Jews are rejecting Christ. And don't worry, he has this idea in Romans 9-11. He didn't see where this was going to be taken. And so if you take him in his context, give him a little grain of salt here. He's not thinking that, just like Luke Acts is not expecting what ends up becoming in this narrative that continues because he's just trying to convince either whoever the context of this group is or this guy, this elite, he's trying to make his people not look bad.
Right. And there's a moral lesson there in that we should all be careful, even if we think we're powerless, when we try to make other people feel mad, or especially put it into writing. Who knows, how it gets, jetted out into the world and expounded. Another thing I come back to in defense of Luke, and I don't defend Luke about very much. I will defend that he was brilliant. I'm sorry, I'm just stuttering at his brilliance in terms of the complicated narrative that he weaves and but in terms of anti-Semitism, for instance, it is different than that in that and I don't know, it's still problematic, of course, to say that the only good Jews are Christians, but it still is, it's at least once removed from racialized anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. So I would say that, but I do think that differently from Paul, even Luke is laying more groundwork because, I would agree with Paula Fredrickson. Yes, Paul is within Judaism. I even go, I don't know if I think Paula is not in the camp. Among those who emphasize Paul within Judaism, there are those who argue that Paul didn't even think Jews had to believe in Jesus, right? There's these two ways to salvation, that Paul was content with Jewish ways of salvation, not involving belief in Jesus, and that Jesus's purpose was for the Gentiles, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's in Paul. I think that's not in Luke. Or at least, right. Luke is meaner and more. I guess Luke has absorbed more imperial values, Roman empirical values, I would say.
Okay, so there's a lot here. I will get to your questions. Don't worry, everybody. Super chat them. I can go right to the top and scroll through. So if you have any questions, feel free. There's a couple of things I hope we can get to, Shelly, that are important. Obviously, we titled this is like Luke.
Oh yeah, the fan fiction.
Well, we got to get into that. Okay. I'll let you go. But is Luke a companion of Paul? And like,
no, I would say no. That is what the tradition, right? Beginning in the late 2nd century, early Christians, it comes important to them to sort of sew things up and to have the authors of the New Testament be linked together and to be given names, right? In the the late 1st century, early 2nd century, there were no names for the Gospels because they're not thought of. The authorial stamp is not important. These are the memoirs of the apostles, right? Or the teachings of Jesus. It's never, it's not until later that it gets said, this is the gospel that was written by Mark, who was a disciple of Peter, or the secretary of Peter. And this is the gospel of Luke, who was the companion of Paul and the physician. And that's mentioned. That gets strung together because is it Timothy? I'm sorry, someone knows better than me.
First,
only Luke is with me. Paul says at the end, pseudonymous Paul says at the end of his life, and that then comes to be, that's Luke. And I confess I forget why he's a physician. But the key reason I would say that Luke is not a companion of Paul is that it's dated too late, right? And then I can give the reasons I think that it's dated too late. I think I'm convinced, as Steve Mason is, I see you had him on the show, that Luke knew Josephus, right? So that means the earliest he could have written is in the late 90s of the 1st century, after Josephus's writings are circulating. I have had to think, and more I'm on board, that Luke might know Pliny's letter to Trajan, which was written in around 112, right? So right. Luke is, he's gathering from these places. And also the way that Luke describes Paul, and that's where I use the phrase fan fiction, which you put up in your title. What Luke is doing to Paul is not a sign that he knows Paul intimately because they traveled on a boat together. Right. But Luke is idealizing Paul. It's kind of like a comic book, I would say, in the sense that Paul is the hero who can do like they stone him and he gets up and keeps on walking, right? He is a citizen of Rome, a citizen, and not just any ordinary citizen. He's a citizen by birth of Rome. He's a citizen of Tarsus, which is this great Hellenistic city. And he's a Pharisee who taught at the feet of Gamaliel. It is impossible to be all those three things. Historically, it is impossible to be both a Pharisee,
which is a separated one,
separating from those, the Goyim, or from the Gentile practices, like we're separating, and a citizen of Tarsus, because if you are a citizen of an ancient Greek city, then you're wearing the purple robes of office and you're slaughtering sheep, right? Or, to Artemis or whoever so you're involved in polytheistic sacrifice, and Paul, there's just no way Paul could do all that. So yeah, I don't think the reason that Luke can write this account of Paul is because he had eyewitness access to Paul in the flesh, but because he knows, again, for Theophilus, that he needs to heroize Paul and make him the best of the best for his readers, who get really gratified by that.
There's something you said that really made me kind of shocked by it a little bit. Because I don't know all the cultural context. I don't know what's going on. What does it mean to be a man? Okay, and this is something that you really emphasize in your article. That, look, I'm the son of a retired Green Beret in the Special Forces, so we were like, go son, he's like hardcore alpha male, that kind of thing, patriarchy all the way. Like, that was my whole life. And I'm learning things that I've never known reading scholars like you and Jennifer Bird. And I'm like, there's a whole world out there that is just beautiful that we're just skipping right over. We don't recognize. And so what makes a man? Why is Paul contradicting Luke here?
Right. No, that's good. And again, when I'm just reading the Pauline letters, I can wrestle with Paul. I have problems with Paul. But I have to say, when I'm reading Acts, then the letters of Paul become better resources for me. And I will just explain it this way. In terms of manliness, Paul in his letters does paradoxically, play with concepts of weakness and strength, right? The crucifixion, God uses the weak, and he emphasizes that Paul does the weaknesses of his own body, right? His illness, he had to stay wherever he's staying because he was ill. And, he admits or concedes what the Corinthians who are mad at Paul say, which is that his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible, right? So he is in his own letters something of a scare figure, or he's definitely weak and degraded, and then he uses that in some paradoxical ways to say, well, I'm weak and humiliated and a bad speaker and all that, but God is using his strength in my weakness, yada yada yada,
or the foolishness of this world to
confound, the foolishness of the cross, right? Or the thorn in the flesh, right? There's all these ways that Paul in his own letters is highlighting his weaknesses for a paradoxical effect. But when you get to Luke, Paul is the manly man, and he's not at this time. And here I rely on the classicist Maud Gleason, her little book, it's called Making Men, where she argues that in this time period, right? So Roman citizens are not off on the battlefield anymore, right? You can't prove your manhood by how many soldiers you slayed or whatever, how many battles you went on or whatever. But oratory becomes the place where Romans prove their manhood in training to deliver speeches. And she points out that this training to deliver speeches was really, I say it over and over in all of my publications. I use it. Maybe I don't know how often one can reuse it, but she calls oratory the calisthenics of manhood in the early 2nd century. That or if you could stand up and do that dramatic oratory, unamplified with your heavy robes on and facilely, fending off anyone in the crowd. I don't know if they're throwing tomatoes. They might be, but it's an athletic event. And that is how Paul is portrayed in the book of Acts. So he's not just a citizen of Tarsus and Rome and a Pharisee under Gamaliel, but he is the best and most eloquent speaker. Beginning, I don't know where his speeches began. I want to say in Acts 13, but if you follow his speeches, and especially the speeches after he is imprisoned, he is like, who's a
Aristotle?
Yeah, well, or Cicero maybe. Like
Okay,
the classic orator. I was trying to think of a modern day orator. I mean, we put Barack Obama in that. Right, he was known for his oratory, or Martin Luther King. I guess Ronald Reagan. I'm just trying to be, reach both sides of the aisle here. But
yeah, someone's going to get offended either way, so whatever.
Yeah, but I would say that is one way that Paul is heroized in the book of Acts, is that he is the manliest man by way of his speeches as well. And that, I mean, in the old days, the Acts versus Paul people would say that Paul's letters emphasize the theology of the cross, whereas Acts emphasizes the theology of glory, because Paul doesn't suffer in Acts, right? He's like the Energizer Bunny, beaten but never destroyed. And so to emphasize the masculinity theme is just a tweak of that theology of the cross versus theology of glory, to say that Acts really does portray Paul as the most manly of men.
And that was big red flag to me. Is like, I guess someone would still, because they have to have it, just like they'd be like, well, he could still be a companion. He just exaggerated, or he wrote a fanciful narrative about Paul. So technically he could still contradict Paul. I'm being the devil's advocate here.
Right. And again, I'm not reading. I guess I'm in the private chat, Joe. I don't, if I look in the comments, will I see something else? And I don't know if there's
tons of people who comment. Don't distract yourself.
Okay. To respond to that, I guess my question would be, why is it important to you to say he is the companion of Paul? Why is that important to you to say that? And I guess also then, in the same way, why is it important that it's literally true? I guess I think it's much more important to understand the works on their own terms. And as I read the work on its own terms, particularly in terms of the dating, it just, it doesn't make sense. It's a later, in the same way that Mark is not written by Mark and Luke is not written by Luke. These are later assigning things that happened in the late 2nd century. And also
the reason is you're a scholar.
So well, but we would like our training to not be elitist. That's part of the reason some of us come on your podcast, is there's no reason it has to be an elite thing to think. I mean, these ideas have been circulating for 200 years. And for instance, just to take one instance, in Germany, I have, in Germany, students in their gymnasium are trained in religion, and they are much more literate about biblical scholarship than Americans as a whole, if I can stereotype. So it doesn't have to be just because I'm elite. It's the question of how do we talk about these texts, more with more knowledge, without meaning that knowledge requires a PhD.
I'll give you an example of why, and then I want to get to Q&A if you're okay with that.
Sure.
The example of why I think that they need him to be a companion is there's a house of cards built in their particular approach to the biblical narrative, is that if he's not a companion and he's saying he's getting, and their way of understanding is the accurate, what actually happened, therefore Acts is not take it to the bank historically reliable, then my entire epistemological framework on Jesus literally being the Son of God, who literally did all these miracles, who literally they have this kind of fundamentalist presupposition. And the whole house of cards falls if they don't have all of that. And my goal is to defang fundamentalism and encourage people, if you're going to be someone of faith, have a scholarly approach, and not to take this to the bank so much so that you're running around actually thinking people are going to burn for all eternity. You're trying to force people into the faith, like what we see happening in Acts, by kind of, it's so good in its oratory that literally people today are convinced, well, you're a Jew and you don't believe in Jesus? You're one of those Acts people. It's got that kind of effect on people.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess that the question of it's the house of cards and the historic, it is so important that the Bible is historically reliable in every, I mean, I guess that so I can't see the viewers. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But I would just say that's sort of a weak faith. I mean, I have a complicated spirituality. I still identify as a Christian, and I'm an ordained United Methodist. But if your faith, if all someone has to do is take out a card and your faith goes away, that's a pretty weak faith. And so, the desperateness, well, it has to be this way. It has to be historically reliable. I mean, several of the biblical scholars that you've had on the show just ask, could go through and make a long list. This is not historically reliable. This is not historically reliable. We can see, but that doesn't mean it's that the scriptures are, and I would call them scriptures. It doesn't mean that they're lying, but they're writing with different assumptions and, different interests than this literal historically reliable thing. To take just one example, again, I can say with absolute certainty that it is, well, I won't say absolute certainty because that's too fundamentalist in itself. But again, the idea that Sergius Paulus, a Roman proconsul on the island of Cyprus, is persuaded by Paul, that would be like saying, I mean, just pick some famous DC politician or some politician, and well, now I'm thinking of Nancy Reagan because I was thinking, that would be like having someone be persuaded by a magician or by an astrologer, right? I mean, I don't want to offend people in different faiths. I'm just thinking of sort of some quack. I mean, Paul would certainly have been perceived by the Roman elite as a quack, he couldn't have converted anyone. So anyway, I'm going off of your very important question about this. It's so important because it has to be so in order for it to be historically reliable. I would not use the Bible as a history book. It's not. It doesn't say that it is.
Thank you. All right, we'll get to Q&A now. Shelly, this is really fun, by the way.
Okay.
And if it's something you can't answer, don't feel like you have to. Okay. Trust me.
If it's hostile, I won't. I can't do hostility. I would need to see.
No, that's why if you see the banner,
writing, and I have to think about them for a while, so I'm not quick on my feet in that sense. But I'll try to be quick on my feet.
I'll let everybody know. Super chats are greatly appreciated, and will get answered by Dr. Shelly Matthews, as long as you're respectful. So anyway, we typically have very respectful comments, even if they're trying to be critical or want to know what you're saying. Caleb Jackson, thank you for the super chat. Caleb, does canonical Acts have more history than other Acts of John, Thecla, etc.? Also, what are your thoughts on Hemmer's work on Acts accuracy?
Oh, Colin Hamer okay, first of all, more history than the Acts of John and Thecla. Well, it depends. Of course, I'm a scholar, so it's always like, well, it depends on what you mean. I would say that it is common to say that, I think it's easier for people to see the miraculous episodes in the Acts of John and Thecla as fictional, and that they're very comfortable with seeing them as fictional because it's not the canon, right? There's a famous in the Acts of Peter, the talking fish, the smoked tuna comes to life, or the talking dog, or the flying person, right? There's a lot more paranormal things going on in some of those gospels. Thecla, for instance, is baptized in a pool of seals, and they're trying to kill her, but the lions won't attack her, and clouds come in, and miraculous things happen. So it is often noted, and I think it's fair to say that there is relatively less of that in the canonical Acts. So if that's what means by more history, you can say, there's less of these, what could be called paranormal or miraculous things. And also it's closer to the time, and, it's concerning Paul and Jesus' crucifixion. So it's concerning some historical events that we have secure dating on from other places. And I don't know, I can't think of Hamer's work on the top of my head, but if he's arguing for Acts accuracy, then I just disagree. I think very little. Luke is a creative author who has a goal of reassuring Theophilus, or people like Theophilus, or people who want to think Theophilus can be reassured by this book. And he is very free, very freely creative. And I sometimes can get into the weeds and argue with these people and say, no, this is historical and that's historical. But it's just, those are not my questions anymore, because I don't have that. I don't have a dog in that fight anymore. I can say, Acts is a very creative text. It is not tied to a modern understanding of historical accuracy. And if it's easier for Luke to make a point by saying some creative thing, like the centurion Cornelius bowing down to Peter as Peter comes into his house in Caesarea, that's things like that didn't happen. The Romans were not deferential like that, so I could just go on. And if Hamer is one of these persons whose goal is to keep this house of cards up, as Derek referred to this historical reliability question, then yeah, that's not where I'm putting my energy. I'm more interested in feminist, womanist, liberation work, ethics and politics, rather than securing down what really happened.
Thank you so much, Caleb. I appreciate the super chat and your response, Shelly. Logan Fisher, do you agree with any criteria of embarrassment?
And by criteria of embarrassment, you mean that if it was so embarrassing but still included, then it's more likely to have been part of, history. And I would say, yeah, flipping to the Gospels. I agree with the Jesus scholars who say that it is historically quite likely that Jesus was baptized by John, for instance. That strikes me as one of those big ones, that why would the church make it up that Jesus was baptized by John? Because that is an embarrassing story, because baptizers are more important than baptizees, right? Mm-hmm. Baptism, John's baptism was for the remission of sins. Jesus didn't sin, those sorts of things. So yeah, I work that way some ways. I'm just working on a feminist politics of resurrection, and I have argued, I am more persuaded by those who say that the stories of women at their empty tomb and the cross and the resurrection are likely signs that that women were involved in those proclamations in a central way. And so the Gospels have to acknowledge it, even though they're also embarrassed by it. So undercut it.
My bad. I'm sorry. I was going to ask you about something. We were talking about criteria of embarrassment, but also in your feminist work, which I can't require or request you enough to go and check out the commentaries, because there are things, I've read many commentaries, and sometimes things are emphasized, sometimes things aren't. Celine, as I was telling you before we started this episode, where I was talking to what's her last name?
Lily.
Lily. Yeah, she was the first person who introduced the idea to me that Rome is the penetrator. And they are the masculine, they are metaphorically always the penetrator, always the male. In all of the templates, when Domitian sets up in Ephesus, all of these different figures of Rome representing the male, going to rape the female at knife point, whatever, the female represented every other nation, every other peoples, but Rome was always the man. And what's interesting about Luke Acts, is it's so addressing a Roman audience, that when Jesus is at his crucifixion, he's not like Mark, he's not like Matthew. He is the hero God who's into your hands. He has full control. And it's this weird, to me, and I'd love to have your thoughts on this, it's this weird situation where here he is about to be penetrated, but he's going to be the hero, manly, kind of I'm not weak and crying and in this situation.
Yeah, no, I would say that. Again, Mark and Matthew portray Jesus's crucifixion more as one might imagine it to have happened. That is where Jesus cries out, right? And it hurts. And he, rolls around the garden saying, Gethsemane, please don't, do this to me. But in Luke, very composed, very much in control. And that is the same with John as well. I have argued, we call it the passion of Christ in Luke, and the passion means to suffer, right, from passio. But it seems to me questionable how much suffering Luke suggests Jesus is undergoing, because he's able to carry on a lot of dialogue, and he's always in control. I mean, he talks a lot, which is physically, illiterately talking, right? Quoting scripture here and there. So yeah, in Luke, I would say Jesus is in control. There's an exception to that. Again, this is a Bart Ehrman thing, and others. The place where Jesus in Luke
sweating blood
bleeds a bloody sweat. But
yeah.
I side with those who think that that's an addition to Luke by a later scribal or community who can't stand, or who has noticed that that Jesus in Luke doesn't suffer and needs to stress that more.
Do you think, and while we're on this, in this question, Logan, thanks for triggering me here with these ideas. Do you think that the same people who are probably interpolating this particular pericope are also the ones who are making the emphasis of Jesus's flesh and bone, his bodily resurrection, to kind of react to communities that might be, I don't know. What are your thoughts about this?
Oh yeah, well, flesh and bone. I have written, and that's not in my more popular work, but the flesh and bone thing. Yeah, definitely Jesus in Luke is material, it's in the later the gospel, the more emphasis on Jesus rising in the flesh, which is, again, that's another reason I think Luke Acts is late, is because that's when, it's in the 2nd century that those conversations really take off. In Matthew, Jesus is sort of this ethereal being when he appears in his resurrected state. And in Mark, of course, he doesn't appear at all. But so what was your question? Luke definitely cares and wants to emphasize the materiality of Jesus, right. The flesh and bones. And there's complicated reasons for that, in my view, that probably too complicated for the podcast. But
I guess to put it fair, would it be fair to say that this is a rolling text, and some of this is probably added in after Marcion debacle and all this stuff is going on?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And what I think almost everyone has to agree on is that the ending of Luke was fluid. That is, if you look at the manuscript tradition, beginning with Luke 22, really 22, Luke 23, Luke 24, those are the final chapters of Luke, right? We don't have just one ancient manuscript of Luke. We have a lot of different ones, and right. There's signs of fluidity. Where things are added, extra emphasis on materiality, extra emphasis on his suffering in Gethsemane, if you will go there. And that's another thing that is, a topic of great interest among New Testament scholars, is the materiality of these texts and the fluidity of some traditions. I would say the ending of these gospel texts was the best place to mess with them. So, for instance, Mark, I don't know if your readers know, many of them surely do, that we think that the shortest ending of Mark, and then this long ending that was added, this appendix that's added. We think an appendix is added to John as well. That is, the original Gospel of John ends at chapter 20, and then 21 is added to get them all in line. And in Luke, it's not so much an extra chapter, but there's a lot of scribal interpolations, I would say, that are working, a 2nd, 3rd century, working towards this Orthodox Christianity, I would say.
Yeah, I think there was brought to Bart Ehrman one time about the end of Luke, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but this idea that he's with them for like 40 days, and there's some, I guess if we're taking it literally, it seems to kind of contradict beginning of Acts. There's something going on that's inserted in there.
Yeah, no, if you read the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts, the question of, the timing of the ascension, et cetera, that's a little off. I haven't thought about that piece of the ending of Luke, particularly in terms of the scribal tradition. I'm thinking more in Luke, that Gethsemane piece, and also the more emphasis on fleshiness. There's more ways in Luke and in the ending of John where there are, emphasis on the hands and emphasis on the touching and emphasis on the emptiness of the grave cloths, in the tomb, that all sort of converge in the fleshiness thing. And I just have forgotten what the ascension issue is, except that they're not, it's not a coherent sequel to read the end of Luke and the beginning of Acts on what the ascension is.
I one more on that, and the next super chat, if that's okay, is the idea that wouldn't this kind of be an issue if we were trying to take the companion approach, because Paul explicitly in 1 Corinthians 15 says, flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom. And here we have the emphasis of flesh and bone. And I've had someone try to actually say, he doesn't say flesh and blood. He says flesh and bone, and Paul says flesh and blood. And it's like, flesh though. I mean, like,
we can stick on the flesh. I am of the view, and my good friend Dan Smith has written on this article or topic as well. I am of the view that Luke knows the writings of Paul, and Luke, like the second century apologists, that verse in Paul, flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, that is a thorn in their flesh. They are so sad and so distressed or anxious about that verse in Paul, because they're moving to the resurrection, the fleshy resurrection, right? The sine qua non is it has to be resurrection of the flesh, and so they emphasize that more and more, and so they do a lot of gymnastics in exegeting Paul, not unlike that. So you're whoever's responded to you, but it's flesh and blood, not flesh and bone, so it's not the same, and therefore there's no contradiction. That's not exactly what they say, it's been a while since I've thought about this. Irenaeus, makes some. They dance around that a lot, that what Paul really meant, blah, 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 really doesn't contradict the idea of the resurrection of the flesh. But again, for those, once you get rid of that anxiousness of, it cannot have any disagreements and historically reliable, then you can start to enjoy the fact that Paul thought that flesh and blood could not inherit the kingdom, and Luke is very insistent that Jesus is flesh. And then you can ask why, why were there these multiple voices on that question?
And I have to say this as a person who's no longer in the faith. I enjoy this. I love learning all of this stuff as someone who isn't in the faith. And if someone is in the faith and they value and respect it, and they could find this, and it somehow they have figured out a way where their faith works, more power to them. It's the extremist views that I see affecting and impacting us often in our day-to-day. And I want people to start thinking more scholarly, because I think you could use these critical thinking skills in all matters of life, not just Bible study.
Yeah, more scholarly. And also, I would even say more reverently. One of my teachers, Christopher Stendhal, was always teasing gently this sort of fundamentalist that think God needs to be defended. You don't have to defend God, or it's like, so there are 4 gospels and there's disagreements, and the work is to insist that they do not disagree. It's like, you don't have to do that. It seems misdirected when the faith, if you will, could be enjoyed instead of so stressfully defended, or reveled in, or relished, or thought of as this. I move my hands a lot when I think about.
No, you're fine.
You mentioned in the text, well, because there needs to be this fluidity, this multiplicity, multivocality, and that sort of rigid fundamentalist. It only means one thing, and it has to mean this, and it just that view it saddens me a little, because it deprives one of richness. And I don't know that that's necessarily hinging just on, intellectual, education. You don't have to have a PhD to get to that place. You just have to be thoughtful, I think. Open to mystery. That's another way some of my very good students would talk about it. You bow to the mystery. You don't understand it all, but and the mystery has a lot of stuff in it.
Thank you. Robert Mahaney, thank you for the super chat. I didn't see a chat there. I got a couple more here, and then we will wrap things up. I would hope we can have you come back. This has been a blast. Let me see. I'm finding my comments here. Finding the Doc Pluromanaut, thank you for the super chat. Good to see you here. Should we look more to the Pseudo-Clementines versus Acts to gain a better picture of the events of early Christianity despite its pseudepigraphy?
Well, I don't know if thank you. That's a good question. And again, I think, yes, you should look to as many documents as you can. The Pseudo-Clementines are very interesting, at least the pieces of them that I've worked on. Now, first, also, I should say that the Pseudo-Clementines is a very large piece of literature. And I have actually a colleague next door who, is an expert in this literature in the ways that I'm not. The piece of it that I've worked on that is very interesting to me is there's this piece. They're called the pseudo-Clementines are said to be more Jewish, and they certainly, and I have to put that in quotes because, of course, it depends on how everything depends on the definition of those words. But in the pseudo-Clementines, this piece that I'm thinking of, Paul is actually the enemy because he goes around persecuting Christians and telling them not to follow the law. And James is the hero. James is the apostle who argues for Jewish law observance and for also, if I remember, and it's been a long time since I thought about this, pseudo-Clementines, there's some point where it argues for the two ways. That is, it's this, Jews, they follow the law of Moses and they're observant, and that is a path to salvation. And Christians, believe in Jesus, and that's their path to salvation, and we're cool with that. And so, in that sense, Doc, plural and not, I would say, yeah, that also helps to. I think that perspective, for instance, is. Helps us to remind that the history of Jews and Christians, Jewish-Christian relations, had more than just one thing going on. If you only read the book of Acts, right, all the Jews who loved Jesus, they're great. All the Jews who didn't love Jesus, they're all evil, going to hell. But that's the book of Acts perspective. But on the ground, if you look at synagogue inscriptions or some of this literature, both rabbinic and early Christian, outside of the canon, you get a sense that there's a little bit more convergence. Sometimes Jews and Christians get along. Sometimes they're in dialogue with each other, or the Christians going to the synagogue to worship, and that sort of thing going on. So I would say yes. That was a long answer. The short answer is yes, you should look. Which is not to say that that's a historical document, but certainly the views of these documents help us have a richer understanding of the varied ways that Jews and Christians related.
Thank you so much. And Doc's it back again. He says, how do we explain oddities like Apollos, who knew John's baptism, or the Ephesians, who never heard of the Holy Spirit? We learn nothing about Christianity's arrival in Rome and no mention of Judas the Galilean, son's demise.
Yes. Oh, man. See, that's so long. And I just want to say on that first one, I want to give a shout out to a colleague of mine who was just zooming into my class yesterday, Mitzi Smith, who is a womanist biblical interpreter who's got a lot of things going on. One of them, which is a book called Womanist Sass. And she has an article there about Apollos and the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts, and how Luke's treatment of both Apollos, who is from Alexandria, and the eunuch who's from Ethiopia is, she calls it that there's a fear and fetish going on of these African figures. What is it about Apollos? He has to be taught the right way. He's not doing it properly. Has to have the way more confirmed, and he only knows the baptism of John. I can't explain it. All I can say is it's a naughty place that suggests that there is more to the story than Luke tells us. Also, pairing with what I said earlier about centers for Christianity, Alexandria and Ethiopia, these are these centers of early Christianity, and Luke doesn't like what's going on there. He suppresses information. Christianity's arrival in Rome, exactly. It's weird, right? Paul goes, there's a lot of things he doesn't tell us about. The Judas of the Galilean son's demise. Now, the Judas the Galilean is mentioned in Acts, right?
Right. Yes.
And so, all I know is that's a sign that Acts read Josephus, but he's not interested in that, right? He, again, even for those who think that Acts is historically reliable, and I'm not one of them, but we all have to agree that Acts does not give us the whole story, that there's many stories, he's not telling us.
What about, what is it, Simon the Samaritan, or is it the magician?
Simon Magus.
Simon Magus. Can you tell us, that's doing it as well, right? A whole nother thing, making a caricature of him and...
Right. Yeah. And there's that weird thing, it essentially assumes that even if he repents, he's not going to get saved. I'm playing fast and loose. I would have to study.
It's like Peter
story.
cursed him or something.
Yeah, I would have to. Again, the magicians in Acts. I doubt that's a historical story, but in this world, there are, one of the big debates is who are the true spiritual leaders and who are the quacks. And there are a lot of quacks out there. There's this famous Roman author, Lucian, who talks about this quack who's got the snake, the snake god he worships, and it's just making fun of that sort of religiosity. And I think Acts gets in on the game by also showing people like that. The story, I haven't worked on Simon Magus so much, but it's in Acts, it's in Ephesus, the end of Ephesus. It's got to be Acts 21, where there's the Jewish exorcist, and then he gets essentially raped by these demons. There's a magician and that sort of thing also going on in the Ephesus episode. So I don't know what to say about it, except that it's also, another thing about the book of Acts is it was written, I think, to enjoy. That there is this sort of adventure and the scenes are pleasurable for the reader because you have things like Simon Magus and, the demon rape scene, which for them was, or at least some readers apparently was a joke. I don't know. I'm
thinking you guys think we're quacks? Call Luke. Luke, we need you to fix this. We're not quacks, and make sure they know it. Thank you so much. LJ, what was Paul's real motive behind his conversion?
Well, I would say first, I would redirect the question, and here I'm channeling people like Paula Fredrickson or Pamela Eisenbaum, that Paul is not a convert in his own story. As he understands himself in the Galatians letter, he has a calling, right? He has a calling to go to the Gentiles, but he is not converting from one faith to another, according to Luke. Now, according to his own epistles. Now, in the book of Acts, I would say there is something like a conversion story told, right? It's in Acts where you get the drama from darkness to light. And so, and according to the Acts version, there's not a motive. It's it's this, what do you call it? Jesus, it's a vision from the heavens, and that is what changes him from a persecutor to a proclaimer of the Jesus movement. But yeah, you don't get, there's not a motive there. And so what is Paul's motive behind his call to the Gentiles? I would say, I think he really did, he has a call. He is, like religious leaders that we study, right? He's driven by a vision and, does extreme things because of that. And some of them are powerfully extreme things that make people remember him, right?
I don't know if you've read, this is the last thing. By the way, no more super chats. We're good. But this is in light of the conversion situation. Well, can you call it that? I guess we'll call it that. You know what scene we're talking about, where Saul ends up becoming Paul. And of course, he sees the bright light. Who are you? It's me, Jesus, whom you persecute. I read Dennis R. MacDonald, and he has a student named Michael Koshinash who takes
I know
very fascinating approach. We did an episode called Better Call Paul Saul, and he takes an approach other academics I've never heard take. And he says, this is mimetically using 1 Samuel to show you when David could have killed Saul. And he says, Saul, Saul, why do you pursue me? And in the Greek, in the Septuagint, it's almost identical in Greek. And he says, when you read this part where Jesus says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? The Greek word is so close to pursue that it's like he's lifting a literary device there. And he thinks that this situation where the Maenads in Dionysus Euripides Bacchae are out there and they're in their frenzy. I can't remember the uncle's name, but he goes to spy on them in the tree. They see him. Pentheus. Then a bright light blinds Pentheus, just like Paul. And the difference is Paul actually has mercy done to him because Jesus is more merciful than Dionysus. So he wonders if there is this literary trope deep into Acts that makes him even more brilliant, or whoever the author is. They're even more brilliant.
Well, again, the intertextuality. I mean, I think some readers would have caught some of that, right? If you hadn't read the David Saul story, you wouldn't catch that allusion. If you hadn't, if you're not Dionysus, you wouldn't have catch that one. But it certainly makes sense. I noticed you had Robin Walsh on a while ago, and I agree with her that these the authors of the Gospels, certainly Luke anyway, is quite educated, and these educated people are reading each other and are conversant in these myths, and I think there are those who know Dionysus myths would have heard or could have heard echoes in Acts, while also seeing different things being done with the stories. Yeah,
I just want to say that I love hearing stuff like that because it tells me how clever, how brilliant, and it gives it kind of an art where I value this literature. And no matter where you're at in life, if you're a person of faith, you're not a person of faith, I want us to value the literature and understand what's going on. That is my goal. I mean, obviously there's some crazies out there. We have to deal with that. But I want everybody, please take the time, pause it at this point, whip out your phone, scan this code right here. It'll take you directly to the Bright website. And this is why I just want to do a short plug for Bright Divinity School.
Bright Divinity School. Yeah, we're in Fort Worth, Texas. Come. I know a lot of people are scared to come to Texas, but we're doing good work here. We are an oasis of social justice, Christianity, ecumenical, interfaith, embracing of LGBTQ communities, doing anti-racist work. So join us if you're brave enough to come to Texas. We'll show you the time.
Well, if Shelly's there, you'll be safe. Go check it out. And also she has the books here on Amazon. I'm reading Luke 1-9 and Luke 10-24, hoping that we can have you come back and we can dive into some of this material.
Yeah, no. I loved that. Luke is amazing. And I can be critical, but it's a fun text to talk about.
Please check her out. Go show some love. Buy the commentaries. Go check out Bright Divinity School. If you're interested in following in these footsteps, the options are there. Also, you can help us out by joining our Patreon. It keeps us alive. We offer true salvation. Just buying the Patreon, joining the Patreon, that is your purchase for your indulgence. So don't worry. Join us. Also, we got the course with M. David Litwell on ancient Greek mysteries. I've been mentioning this on our live streams. Okay. I'm going to be launching one with James Tabor and, of course, Delcy Allison Jr. on the quest for the historical Jesus. We have more academics joining our courses every day. Be on the lookout. I'm also helping Bart Ehrman with his Finding Moses course. So you're going to want to check us out. You're going to have to plug in and become part of the family of MythVision. Are there any final words from you, Shelly, to our audience you might want to leave them with?
Man. I didn't think of like a final word. Just, I have, I have enjoyed my time here and encourage all of you. Questions are better than answers, right? So keep asking the questions and reading, thinking, and do it with compassionate hearts in a time where there's a lot of meanness out there. How's that?
Yeah, that I hope that you take that and walk away with it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Shelly. And let's do this again.
Yeah. Thank you, Derek. It was fun.
Never forget, we are MythVision.